सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया. That's it. But listen though.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा. इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए.
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hi, and welcome to this week's edition of Crosshairs, the print show where we discuss the big geopolitical or security story of the week. We're honored to be joined in this edition by Dr. Raffaello Pantucci, who's at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. He probably knows more about terrorism and all things extremism than anyone else I know. I've followed his work for many years. We're also delighted to be joined by Maya Mirchandani at the Observer Research Foundation, who spends more of her nights than I care to think of following strange extremist groups online and lurking on their social media. And of course, my colleague Raghav Bhikchandani, who many of you know, who's been monitoring recent events in Germany, where this week's Crosshair takes us. I'll start with you, if I may, Raffaello. Does this putsch really matter? Is extremism, if you like, pimple on the body of the European and United States body politic? Or is this something we should really be concerned about as a potential threat to important nation states and to polities?
So first, thank you for the invitation. It's great to join you and join such an illustrious panel. I think it is important. I think this event, as harebrained as it can look, and it does sound in terms of what they were hoping to really achieve. I mean, Germany is the world's fourth largest economy, by nation state. So this is a group of people thinking that they would be able to install some sort of king and take over, using force of will or God knows what, take over this country. It seems like a completely insane concept, but I think we have to put it into a wider context, which is a wider context where we've seen a kind of growing level of anti-establishment and anti-government feeling really across the West. And in fact, probably further afield than that. Now, of course, events on January 6th back in Washington is a big marker of where we saw Capitol Hill stormed by this large mass of people. Whether they planned on taking things over or just disrupting, we shall see. It doesn't seem like they had the same sort of a plan here. But within a German context, the other thing to remember is that this group seems to basically have emerged from something called the Reichsbürger movement, which is this German kind of community that see themselves as rejecting the kind of German state that was built after the Second World War, which they define as something that was imposed upon them by the United States. And they want a different Germany. And they've lived very much away from the state, a lot of them, for a very long time. And there's quite a few of these people actually in Germany. And in fact, just earlier this year, a different cell was arrested for planning the attempted murder of the health minister. And this comes as part of a bigger shift that we've seen across Europe, where we've seen lots of these sorts of anti-state groups coming together. And they seem to be reacting to COVID. A lot of them seem to be quite far right-wing, but it does seem to be something which is gathering quite a lot of pace in some parts of the continent. And this particular group is kind of the biggest expression we've seen of this yet.
Maya, you've been watching extremist groups in the United States as well. And one of the fascinating things to me about this Reichsbürger story is the way they drew on this conspiracy cult, which we haven't paid a lot of attention to in India, called QAnon. Is this something that you think is a significant phenomenon, conspiracies floating from one end of a continent to another end of a continent, people picking up on ideas, however deranged they might be, to build entire movements? What is going on here?
So I mean, what I was saying is that I think it's very hard to say whether this sort of group of disparate people and disparate ideas can necessarily come together as part of one single movement or behind an idea. So it's a question of mobilizing them on the basis of a call to gather at some point. I mean, I'm not talking about the German example specifically. I'm talking about even what, say, happened on January 6th with the US insurrection. There were individual leaders and certain groups that might be more organized or more coherent as groups. But the fact that they were able to rally so many people together meant that they were communicating a message of some kind that was attractive. And that message of attraction, I think, has to do with the fact that it's feeding of populist politics, of anti-minority, anti-liberal rhetoric, anti-establishmentarianism, if that's a word, and a sort of hyper-nationalist tendency. So we're looking at right-wing, what we like to call right-wing movements that are rallying around the idea of my right. And is this translating into radicalized movements? Is this translating into violence? I think January 6th was an example. This German incident is an example. But there are many such small acts of violence that align with a cause that's essentially meant to change status quo. And I think that's really what it is. Online groups gather around these ideas. There's, I think, a scholar in the UK who called it like a post-organizational form of radicalization. There is no one organization. There could be individuals, but it is more the idea.
Raffaello, I'll come back to you for a moment, if I may, before going to Raghav. You've watched groups like, dating back to when the internet was just a shimmer in our eyes. Al-Qaeda and other extreme movements linked to the Islamist cause on sort of the extreme fringes of political movements there mobilized people long before there was an internet. But they ultimately proved quite unsuccessful until they were able to add training facilities to that, weapons to that, and money to all of this. Are these sort of new right movements in Europe and the United States, in your view, approaching that moment of criticality where they can actually conduct lethal action on some kind of significant level?
I think there's lots of worrying indicators that we can see increasingly in this space. And I think what's particularly disturbing about the German context is the problems that we've seen of far-right groups and movements and ideas taking hold in security forces, to the point where we've seen the German armed forces have to disband entire units because they concluded that the sort of levels of extreme right tendency within the group was so high that they just didn't want to deal with it anymore. In police forces around the country, they have a constant problem. They're constantly disrupting these sorts of WhatsApp groups where people are essentially sharing Nazi propaganda amongst each other. And it's a real problem. And the worrying thing, of course, is you see more and more security people getting involved, then suddenly you're actually talking about a certain capability that the groups are developing as well. So I think it is quite worrying. And this is, I think, one of the triggers for why the police in Germany moved, because it looked like they were making inroads into the armed forces in particular. And that really started to shift things. You may remember, your audience may remember, I can't remember if it was earlier this year or last year, there was an instance in Belgium where an individual soldier, a special forces man, suddenly took off into the woods with all his guns, left behind messages saying he was going to go after a particular prominent virologist in the country who'd been sort of the front of the government's anti-COVID response. And he was seemingly going after, and there was a huge panic, single soldier, and he ended, I think he killed himself in the end, and that was kind of the end of that case. But he was part of a group. There was other people out there who were close to him, who had the same sorts of ideas as him. And I think this is what's really quite worrying, is that you are seeing the capability start to come in terms of some of the people who are joining these groups. And that's where I think you can see in Europe in particular, you're seeing a lot of concerns starting to develop. Because as you say, a bunch of guys sitting on the internet chit-chatting to each other is not necessarily a concern in itself. It's once they have the resources to actually do something. And when you're talking about soldiers who have training and access to weapons, then it's really a cause of great concern.
I'll just come back to that topic again in a second, but I wanted to go to Raghav for just a minute. One of the things people often say, Raghav, is that this is silliness. We're not back to the age of fascism and the Third Reich. Of course, the answer to that would be that at the time the Third Reich was rising, Hitler was rising. If we look at contemporary accounts, nobody took those groups very seriously either, to their abiding peril. As someone who's lived and worked in the United States, do you feel that the influence of these extreme groups on the ground has actually increased significantly, that larger numbers of people are supporting these ideas? Or do you think that it's still a fringe phenomenon that exercises coercive power disproportionate to its legitimacy in society? Are these, in other words, nutcases, maybe with guns, but nutcases, or guys whose ideas have some real hold in wider society?
No, the real hold on society is definitely increased. It may have been a much more broader, at least tepid support for someone like a Donald Trump 6 years ago. Now that Donald Trump has shifted even further to the right with his many claims of election fraud, election denialism, a lot of the candidates he endorsed in the recent midterm elections were also people who bought into the election denialism, and so did their voters. And so at least a few, there wasn't a red wave, but at least a few of those people were elected as well to public office. So now the phenomenon you have in the US is there's people in public office who never accepted the results of the last election. So that's definitely one issue. And if we circle back to what's happening in Germany, that yes, we've all seen that it was a sort of failed harebrained coup, but some of these ideas have long since been mainstreamed. Whether you look at parties like the AfD, I think in the last election they got around 80, 83 seats. So some of these ideas have already been in the mainstream for quite a while.
Raffaello, coming to you, I mean, one of the interesting questions to me in all of this is Europe doesn't have a tradition of unregulated gun usage in quite the way the United States does. Do you believe that in addition to these networks that we're seeing where they're mobilizing, talking to each other, planning things and so on, that there is also some sort of organized structure to the acquisition of lethal capability by these groups? Are we seeing, say, an uptick in assassinations or assassination attempts by these kinds of actors?
I mean, you've seen increase in plots on the extreme right. That's been a sort of pattern that we've seen over the past few years, really. And COVID seems to have done something to it as well. In some ways, even made it potentially a bit worse. A lot of those plots that take place tend to be lone actors, and not many of these lone actors get their hands on many guns. They do sometimes, and criminal vectors tends to be the place. The thing about Europe and guns is that it is much more regulated, and say not like the United States, but there are still hunting cultures. So in Switzerland, for example, every household has a rifle, right? It's a sort of national mobilization thing, but it's also a hunting thing, so everyone there has kind of guns. And so there are countries like that. But the biggest problem from a weapons perspective is at the moment, actually, the war in Ukraine, where there is a huge amount of weaponry going into that battlefield, and a huge amount probably leaking off. And we have seen in the past, back in, I can't remember now if it was 2016 or 17, there was a French far-right extremist who was actually arrested by the Ukrainian special forces or Ukrainian intelligence as he was trying to leave the country, having just purchased a truck full of weaponry, which he wanted to bring back to France. And there is a lot of concern at the moment about what's happening in Ukraine. At the moment, all of the hardware in Ukraine is focused on Ukraine and the war that's happening there. But as that goes on, that will start to leak. We saw this back in the 1990s with the war in Bosnia and the war in Yugoslavia, where a lot of weaponry there leaked. If you go back and remember the attacks that we saw in 2015 by ISIS, those guns that were used in November of that year, the Bataclan, they were sourced from networks that originally got it from the Balkans. So there's a lot of kind of weaponry that does come from these places, and it does have a habit of slipping into terrorist networks. And there's a lot of concern about sort of right-wing ideas and people connecting, and actually the battlefield in Ukraine giving them an interesting place to train, get some experience, and more crucially, get the hardware to ultimately then try to launch attacks. And as anyone who studied this knows, once you get access to heavy weaponry, that's when you really start to see, unfortunately, casualties get impacted. Because usually if groups can't get access, which usually they struggle with, if it's just knives, then there's only so much you can do. Whereas if you have high-powered weaponry and people have experience in using it, then you've got a really dangerous mix coming together.
Yeah. Maya, if I may turn to you, I mean, to go back to what you were saying about India being relatively sanguine about this because our threshold for political violence is much higher. One of the reasons why people have been sanguine about it, I would put to you as a question, is that you've seen political movements of the extreme right take power through democratic means without really having to go down the route of the putsch or the armed coup or infiltrate the armed forces. Given that the right is in power, do you still foresee some kind of threat emerging to the state from actors even further to the right who feel excluded by this setup? Or is right-wing mobilization mainly something that's contained in the political system, maybe contained not for desirable ends, but nonetheless contained by mainstream politics?
While the right may have come to power through democratically elected, through a democratic election and through democratic means, the ideology that is espoused, which is fundamentally anti-minority, anti-elitist, anti-liberal, at its fundamental levels, is something that appeals to a wide section. And therefore, if that wide section is perpetrating acts of violence, small petty acts of violence as they may be, and there is some kind of sanction because it's not worth law enforcement's time, why crime as opposed to X crime, if there's this constant equivalence being made, you are going to be in a situation where they are going to be more emboldened. We've seen that happen, that the state is going to have to come up with some kind of response to these actors, which is beyond the ambit of they are just criminals and therefore being prosecuted under the law as criminals. Define them as violent actors. I think that's the challenge before the state right now. If you see them as a national security risk that have the potential to organize, that have the potential to defy authority, even if that authority today is, is an ideology or an authority that they support. That's today. We don't know what could happen tomorrow. So I think these are questions that need to be answered. And also, the one thing that's missing in the conversation, at least in India, is what is the impact that this kind of political violence has or could have on fueling extremism and the cycle of extremism further. So therefore, if it is a national security concern, should it not be addressed in the same way that jihadist extremist actors are addressed in India? I think that's a question for law enforcement.
That's a really interesting point, and I think one that merits a much wider debate than this one. And I'd like to come back to in some future show. But a question for you, Raghav. Do you share Raffaello's pessimism about Ukraine turning, if you like, into a vortex of weapons and potentially radicalized people acquiring training? One of the sort of optimistic assessments you hear among some people is that, look, Putin's back has been broken. This war is more or less coming to, is sort of grinding down, if nothing else. This is not something we're going to have to live with the consequences of for a great length of time. As someone who's watched Ukraine, do you share that optimism, or are you less sanguine about it?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag because we do have to look at whether the endless rumors about Putin's current state and his health and what the future holds for Russia, we do have to consider that. But at the same time, there definitely, especially from the American side and a little bit from the Western European side, there has been a very constant funneling of money and weapons, almost unregulated, into Ukraine. And as the war either dies down to some form of a ceasefire or some form of a stalemate, there will be the question of where will these weapons go now? What happens next? So yeah, definitely I wouldn't say I'm very optimistic, no.
Raffaello, I'll give you the last word in this program. One of the things that interests me about what Maya was just saying about taking violent radicalism seriously is that the global system, if you like, has a quite poor record of doing this. The rise of Al-Qaeda and various other jihadist groups wasn't taken very seriously. In the build-up to the Rwanda genocide, tensions in Rwanda weren't taken very seriously. And are we going down the same route, as it were, with white ethno-nationalism and neo-Nazi groups, of being a little more relaxed about this than we ought be? Or do you see police and intelligence services, at least in the West, waking up and putting this, giving this the importance it should be getting?
I mean, look, I think it's it is getting a lot more attention. You know, if you look at statements from senior security officials in Germany, they all say their biggest problem is the right wing. You know, they say this, they quite openly will talk about it. If you look at the UK, you can see the security service there has said it's ramped up its focus on the extreme right. It's now taking the lead on that. It used to be a police lead, now it's a security service. That's MI5. You know, if you look at France, you can see that the French Interior Minister talks a lot more about extreme right-wing plots that they've disrupted. So I do think there's a lot more effort to take it seriously, and they recognize that there's a problem. I actually think in some cases they're probably going a bit further than is necessary, because in fact, the threat isn't the same everywhere. And this is, I think, a key problem, is that there's a habit of homogenizing it, when in reality, in the United States, it's clearly a massive problem. In Germany, it's clearly a massive problem. In other parts of the continent in Europe, it's a problem. But in the UK, it is, but of a different sort, you know, and I think that's the key thing. It's getting your calibration right in every place. But I think the other issue, which I think European polities are really struggling with, which I think touches a bit on what Maya was saying about the context in India, is that it starts to feel like it's bleeding into the mainstream. And that's really where there's a problem. When you've got political parties, you know, amongst the people who was arrested in Germany was a former AfD MP. You know, she was apparently going to be the one who's going to be created the justice minister in this new government they were going to create, you know. And so, you know, that bleed over, you see, that is concerning, because the problem there is that then it becomes very difficult in some cases to actually clamp down on this problem or deal with it in a clear-eyed way, because there's parts of the sort of mainstream spectrum which touch on parts of these groups as well. And that starts to make it quite difficult for security forces to figure out, okay, what do we crack down on, what shouldn't we crack down on? And how do we actually handle this in a way which doesn't look like political persecution and actually potentially make the very problem worse? So that kind of bleed over is really where the problem area lies. I do think security forces in Europe are certainly much more, and the United States actually, are talking about this problem and dedicating much more resource to it than they were before. But the problem is, you know, they're going to deal with the hard end of the problem. But as everyone on this call knows well from looking at violent Islamists and other jihadist groups and others, is the violent guys are part of the problem. But actually, there's a kind of bit before that, which is spreading the ideas and propagating and promulgating the sort of violent ideology which underpins it. And if you're not dealing with that as well, you're only ever really managing the problem. And it's going to kind of continue to bump back. And I think that's really where the struggle you're going to start to see coming into, how to really crack down on that part as well, without being seen as actually stepping on democracy and trampling on people's rights and shutting down the political space.
I'd like to thank you all for what's been a really fascinating discussion. And, you know, just to underline again that new threats to nation states erupt all the time in the strangest ways. In 1933, someone saying that National Socialism or fascism in Germany was a serious threat would have been laughed at. In fact, the journalist Sebastian Haffner has a fabulous piece in his diary where he says, well, all kinds of crazy people are promising solutions. There's a guy who wants nudism. There's another guy who wants some sort of hippie flavored Jesus Christ stuff. And there's this nut called Hitler who says that it's all the Jews. And of course, a few years later, it didn't seem quite so casual. Nation states need to take these problems seriously. I think that's the takeaway from this. Irrespective of how trivial, insignificant, or even sympathetic they might be to the emergence of violent extremist actors. Raghav Bhikchandani, Maya Mirchandani, Rafael Pantucci, thank you very much. And I will look forward to having you back on another episode of Crosshairs in the near future.